Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is @CloseTalking. I am @Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is @Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is @CloseTalkingPoetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CloseTalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show. Hello and welcome to Close Talking. I am Jack Rossiter Munley. For today's special episode, rather than examine a poem, I want to take on a subject that is as near and dear to my heart as it is an odd fit for a poetry podcast. National security. I have a simple proposition that I want to explore. Poetry is good for national security. Poets and poetry are not often given much consideration when it comes to quote-unquote hard topics like political strategy and national security. On The West Wing, for example, every liberal's favorite government fantasy, there is an almost perfect portrayal of all the different negative stereotypes of poets and poetry. They come in the Season 3 episode, The U.S. Poet Laureate. In this episode, the Poet Laureate, played by Laura Dern, is in turn either overly emotional, impractical, or ineffective at advocating for her political positions. Toby, a character, for the record, whom I love, our West Wing staffer, politely educates her on the way that the real world of politics works, bursting her idealistic, emotionally motivated poetic bubble. The truth is, poetry, soft as it may be, has a lot to offer. The political scientist Joseph S. Nye Jr. writes about the different kinds of power that operate in the world. For him, there's hard power, a nation's military might, and there's also soft power, a nation's cultural influence. The current president's proposed budget, which includes funding cuts to the arts, entitlement programs, and the State Department, while simultaneously calling for increases in military spending, was described by its supporters within the administration as a hard power budget. When thinking about national security, this kind of budget makes intuitive sense. This outlook makes intuitive sense. If our nation is going to be at war, we better have the biggest military with the best weapons. This proposition is irrefutable. Similarly, If we want to prevent war, isn't it better that our military should be so fearsome that other nations tremble at the thought of engaging us in conventional warfare? Well, first of all, no. We already spend nearly 2.5 times more on defense than any other country on the planet. That reality aside, any increases in defense spending should be strategically motivated, not for show. Second, this kind of planning fails to take the end goal, national security, into account. Is the nation more secure when it's in a military conflict with an adversary? No. The nation is safer when a corps of dedicated civil servants work to prevent armed conflict from occurring. The kind of civil servants, incidentally, who work at the State Department, whose funding is being cut. Now, similarly, when a nation focuses on increasing soft power, what they actually increase is their desirability. If countries around the world admire your nation's culture, admire the poems your poets write, admire the films that your filmmakers make, they want to be like you, and they are less likely to engage you in military conflict. That makes your nation more secure. But more than a focus on soft power, more than the desirability that great cultural works can create, the real boost to national security that poetry offers comes from the way in which poetry facilitates reader and listener engagement. So take, for example, this poem from Emily Dickinson. It's going to be discussed on an upcoming Close Talking podcast, so stay tuned for that too. It's called To Make a Prairie. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. One clover and a bee. And reverie. The reverie alone will do, if bees are few. Now, in this poem, Emily Dickinson breaks down a prairie into its elemental forms. All you need for a prairie as vast as the Great Plains is a flower and something to spread its pollen. A whole expansive field is condensed into its embryonic components. But the poem goes further. It uses the prairie as a stand-in for any large, boundless desire or goal. Maybe it seems impossible for you, one tiny person with small, meager tools to accomplish great deeds. But, the poem says, if you have desire, if you have within you that reverie, you too can attain even your loftiest goals. You too can make your personal prairie. Now, the poem does not at any point explicitly state this message. All the reader is actually given is a collection of contradictory, declarative statements about what makes a prairie. Poetry as a form, however, cues the reader to be inherently active in a way that almost no other art form does. What makes a poem rather than just a narrative story is all of the blank spaces that are left in. Of course, there are impressionistically written stories and narratively clear poems, but the reason to use poetry to convey an emotional or intellectual point is to play with language in a way that other types of writing simply do not allow. Emily Dickinson, in her poetry, was famous for using strange line breaks and invented punctuation to try and most accurately convey the way her work should be read. She wanted to use every tool at her disposal to bring the words as she heard them in her head to her readers. The precision with which she rendered her vision is part of what makes her work so endlessly fascinating. I, as a reader, am always looking harder at each comma, period, and dash. I wonder why she broke her line in the middle of a sentence, and in the case of To Make a Prairie, why in the space of such a short poem does she give so many different answers to the simple implied question of what makes a prairie? There's a reason that Emily Dickinson wrote poetry rather than essays or novels. An essay can impart information and make a compelling argument. A story can take a reader on an emotional journey. A poem, by necessity, is almost an invitation. The poet has a message, one that can only be divined by some level of deeper engagement with the text. Again, this is true to some degree of all written work of greater complexity, but with poetry, there are so many more stylistic and literary tools at the artist's disposal, and usually also in play in the artist's work, that there's an a priori level of complexity. Some poems wear their meaning on their sleeve, others bury it deep beneath layers of literary technique and reference. But all poems are to some degree mysterious. Look at Emily Dickinson's poem. She never explicitly states her subject. The question that she's answering is never mentioned, and the answers she gives are at the very least elliptical and could easily be described as misleading. By presenting her work as a poem, she invites the reader in and asks them to share with her in meaning making. Now I want to return to the initial concept, national security. Close your eyes. Listen to the words. National security. What do you see? Generals in uniforms? Military fatigue-clad figures in the desert? The president, current or former, in the Oval Office surrounded by the Joint Chiefs? These are the images that are usually associated with national security. But let's look at the phrase national security as we would a poem. Are the images I just mentioned, those most frequently associated with quote-unquote national security, actually those that keep us secure? Well, on one level, yeah, I think they are. Those are the people, generals, members of the military, who are tasked with keeping the nation safe in its most dire moments, and it would be foolish to discount that. But on a day-to-day basis, I think there are other arenas of equal importance. We have a First Amendment that ensures the right to freedom of speech. That keeps the nation secure by protecting those of differing viewpoints. It allows for dissent. The First Amendment also protects a free press that, to use one of my favorite quotes from the play Inherit the Wind, can comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Journalists who investigate corruption domestically and internationally, who hold leaders accountable and publish pieces critical even of sitting presidents without suffering draconian governmental reprisals, they set an example for other nations on how to treat journalists. That helps our national security. Filmmakers whose visions of life are transmitted across the globe, engendering goodwill towards the United States for being a nation that fosters and values such creativity and talent. They too are working for national security. The list goes on. Now, the news for the last few weeks has been a topsy-turvy roller coaster on the foreign policy, international relations, national security front. The president has bombed without strategy and lied with impunity. The actions themselves, sending missiles to strike a Syrian airfield, dropping the mother of all bombs on ISIS militants in Afghanistan, and sending ships, supposedly, in the direction of North Korea, look on the surface like the strong, decisive acts of a leader committed to muscular, hard power American engagement on the world stage. A leader committed to a traditional vision of national security. But I urge you, see the news with the eyes of a poetry reader. Look beyond the headlines. Airstrikes without strategic follow-through, made by a nation refusing to take civilians as refugees, are strikes that say, we care about the weapon used, chemicals, not the victims. Dropping the mother of all bombs on ISIS militants says, focus on the ordinance, not the mission. And claiming to send ships to North Korea when they are in fact not there at all says either we don't know where our ships are or you can't trust anything we say. All of this weakens our national security. A focus on soft power strengthens our national security, as does having the critical view of a poetry reader. I'm Jack Rossiter Munley, and this has been Close Talking.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? Get him off the mic. Whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry. And we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything is possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.